The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as the stranger rode in on a midnight black stallion, his eyes as cold as gunmetal and his reputation riding ahead of him like a storm cloud. Josie Reeves stood frozen on the boardwalk outside her mercantile, her hand instinctively tightening around the broom handle as she watched the newcomer dismount with fluid grace that belied the danger he radiated. The year was 1878, and trouble had just arrived in their peaceful corner of Wyoming Territory. The man wore a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes, dark trail clothes coated with the dust of many miles, and twin colts resting comfortably at his hips. His spurs jingled with each deliberate step as he tied his horse to the hitching post. The locals who had been going about their business moments before seemed to evaporate from the street, mothers calling their children inside, shopkeepers finding sudden interest in organizing their wares. Josie, however, stood her ground, something about the stranger keeping her rooted in place. Perhaps it was the way he moved like a mountain lion, all controlled power, or maybe it was the momentary glimpse she caught of his face when he tilted his head up to survey the town. Despite the hardness in his jaw and the scar running along his left cheek, there was something in his eyes that spoke of more than just the violence his appearance promised. "Afternoon, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble as he approached the mercantile. "Your establishment open for business?" Josie straightened her spine, all 5 feet and 4 inches of her standing tall as she could. At 26, she'd been running her father's store alone for 3 years since the influenza took him, and she dealt with all manner of difficult customers. "It is," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest, "though I'll thank you to leave any trouble outside, Mr. Harrington," he replied after a pause. "Hank Harrington." "Well, Mr. Harrington, I'm Josie Reeves. This is my store, and we maintain a peaceful establishment." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Just looking for supplies, Miss Reeves. Been on the trail a long while." She nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter the mercantile. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in, and Josie moved behind the counter, placing the physical barrier between them more for her peace of mind than any real protection it might offer. Hank removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Up close, she guessed him to be perhaps 32 or 33, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd seen enough for 2 lifetimes. "What brings you to Willow Creek, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, watching as he examined a shelf of canned goods. "We're not exactly on the main trail." "Looking for work," he answered simply, selecting a few cans and placing them on the counter. "Heard there might be some ranches hiring." "There's the Cooper place," she offered, tallying his purchases. "And the Hammond spread to the north. Both good men who pay fair wages." Hank nodded, adding tobacco, ammunition, and coffee to his pile. "Any place in town to get a hot meal and a room, Mrs. Whitaker runs a boarding house 2 streets over. The food's good and the beds are clean." She hesitated before adding, "though she's particular about who she lets stay." Those piercing blue eyes studied her for a moment, meaning she don't take kindly to men who look like trouble. "I didn't say that," Josie countered, though they both knew that's exactly what she meant. "Don't worry, Miss Reeves. I can be on my best behavior when needed." There was that almost smile again, a slight softening around his eyes that made her wonder about the man behind the dangerous facade. As she wrapped his purchases in brown paper, the door opened again, the bell announcing the arrival of Sheriff Thomas Miller, a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache who'd kept order in Willow Creek for nearly 15 years. "Afternoon, Josie," he said pleasantly before his eyes landed on Hank. The sheriff's expression immediately hardened. "Don't believe I've made your acquaintance, stranger." Hank turned slowly, his posture relaxed but alert. "Just passing through, Sheriff. Hank Harrington." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "Harrington, that name sounds familiar." "Common enough name," Hank replied, placing coins on the counter to pay for his goods. "Planning on staying long in Willow Creek?" "Depends on the work." Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. "Well, while you're here, I'll expect you to keep to yourself and avoid trouble. We're a peaceful town." "So I've been told," Hank said, glancing briefly at Josie before gathering his purchases. "Good day, Sheriff. Miss Reeves." After he left, the sheriff turned to Josie with concern etched on his weathered face. "That man's got the look of a gunslinger, Josie. Best keep your distance." "He was perfectly civil, Sheriff," she replied, though she couldn't deny the air of danger that surrounded Hank Harrington. "Civil or not, men like that bring trouble. I've seen it too many times." He sighed heavily. "Just be careful." After the sheriff left, Josie found herself staring out the window, watching as Hank Harrington led his black stallion down the street toward Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. There was something about him that called to her, some mystery she couldn't quite name. Despite the warnings and her own better judgment, she knew with absolute certainty that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine September day that made Josie grateful for the beauty of Wyoming Territory. She opened the mercantile early as always, sweeping the boardwalk and arranging the outdoor display of farming tools before the heat of the day set in. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Hank approaching until his shadow fell across the doorway. "Morning," he said, hat in hand. He looked different somehow. He'd shaved, his dark hair was neatly combed, and his clothes, while still worn, were clean. "Hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she replied, surprised by his transformation. "We're open. What can I help you with?" "Call me Hank," he said, following her inside. "And I was hoping to ask about those ranches you mentioned. Best way to approach them for work." Josie set aside her broom and moved to the counter. "Cooper's place is closest, about 3 miles west of town. He lost a couple of hands last month when they headed to California chasing gold rumors. Hammond's is larger, but it's a good half-day's ride north." Hank nodded, seemingly weighing his options. "Cooper sounds promising. Any advice on approaching him?" "He's straightforward, values honesty and hard work. He'll likely ask about your experience." She paused, studying him. "Have you worked cattle before?" A genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. "Yes, madam. Grew up on a ranch in Texas before." His voice trailed off, the smile fading. "Before I took to wandering." That brief glimpse of his past intrigued her. There was clearly more to Hank Harrington than the dangerous gunman he appeared to be. "Frank Cooper's fair," she continued. "He pays well and treats his men with respect. Just be straight with him." "I appreciate the guidance, Miss Reeves." "Josie," she corrected without thinking, then felt a flush of warmth in her cheeks. "Everyone calls me Josie." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection neither of them had anticipated. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the moment as Mrs. Whittaker herself entered. The boarding house proprietress was a plump, cheerful widow in her 50s who treated the whole town as her extended family. "Good morning, Josie dear." "And Mr. Harrington," she added, her tone notably cooler when addressing him. "I need some flour and sugar, if you please." "Of course, Mrs. Whittaker." Josie moved to gather the items, aware of the older woman's appraising gaze shifting between her and Hank. "I should be on my way," Hank said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the information, Josie." The way he said her name with a subtle gentleness that contrasted with his rough appearance sent an unexpected shiver through her, after he left, Mrs. Whitaker wasted no time in voicing her concerns. That man checked into my boarding house last night, and I don't mind telling you he makes me nervous. There's something in his eyes. He's seen things, done things. He was perfectly polite to me, Josie replied, measuring flour into a paper sack. Oh, he's polite enough. Paid in advance, keeps to himself, but mark my words, he's running from something or someone. The older woman leaned across the counter conspiratorially. Sheriff Miller was asking about him this morning. Says he's trying to place the name. Harrington thinks he might be wanted somewhere. Josie's hand stilled momentarily. Did the sheriff say that? Not in so many words, but I could tell he's suspicious. Just be careful around him, dear. A young woman alone has to watch herself. Though she nodded in agreement, Josie couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment at the warning. There was something about Hank that called to her, perhaps. It was the glimpses of kindness she'd seen beneath his hard exterior. Or maybe it was simply the mystery he represented in her otherwise predictable life. Later that afternoon, as the day's business was winding down, Josie caught sight of Hank returning to town, dust coating his clothes and horse. He rode directly to the livery stable and dismounted, his movements betraying a slight stiffness that hadn't been there earlier. Curiosity got the better of her, and after locking up the mercantile, she found herself walking toward the livery. She told herself she was simply being neighborly, checking whether a potential customer had found work. She found him brushing down his stallion, his back to the entrance. He must have heard her footsteps because he spoke without turning. Figured you might come asking. How did you know it was me? She asked, stopping just inside the stable door. He glanced over his shoulder, that almost smile playing at his lips. Your step, light but purposeful. The observation surprised her. Few people paid such close attention to details. So, she ventured, did you speak with Mr. Cooper? Hank nodded, returning his attention to his horse. Starting tomorrow, ranch hand work, decent pay. His hands moved methodically with the brush. He's a good man, like you said, didn't ask too many questions. That's wonderful, she said, genuinely pleased for him. As she stepped further into the stable, she noticed a dark stain on his sleeve. You're bleeding, he glanced down as if just noticing it himself. It's nothing. Barbed wire caught me while fixing a fence. Cooper wanted to see if I knew my way around ranch work. Let me see, she insisted, moving closer. It's fine, he said firmly, but she was already at his side, gently taking his arm. You need to clean this properly or it'll fester, she said, examining the torn sleeve and the jagged cut beneath. Come with me, I have supplies at the store. He hesitated, then sighed in resignation. You're determined, aren't you? Some might call it stubborn, she admitted with a small smile. But infections are serious business out here. Back at the mercantile, Josie lit several lamps against the encroaching evening darkness and led Hank to the back room where she kept her personal supplies. She indicated a chair and busied herself gathering clean cloths, a basin of water, and a bottle of alcohol. This will sting, she warned as she cleaned the wound. Despite her gentle touch, she felt him tense when the alcohol made contact with the open cut. Had worse, he said simply, his eyes following her movements. I'm sure you have, she replied, concentrating on her task. This doesn't look like your first scar. He remained silent as she worked, the only sound his measured breathing and the occasional splash of water as she rinsed the cloth. When she finally looked up from her task, she found his intense blue eyes studying her face. Why are you helping me? He asked quietly. Sheriff doesn't trust me. Mrs. Whitaker thinks I'm trouble. Yet here you are, tending to me like I'm worth the effort. The raw honesty in his question caught her off guard. Everyone deserves kindness, Mr. Harrington. Hank, he corrected softly. Hank, she agreed, returning to bandaging his arm. And perhaps I see something in you that others are too quick to overlook. And what might that be?" His voice had lowered to a near whisper. She finished tying off the bandage before answering, her eyes meeting his directly. "A good man who's trying to outrun his past." For a moment, he looked genuinely startled, as if she'd somehow seen straight through the walls he'd built around himself. Then his expression shuddered once more, though not completely. "You see too much, Josie Reeves," he finally said, rising from the chair, "and you put too much faith in strangers." "Perhaps," she conceded, gathering her medical supplies. "Or perhaps I'm a better judge of character than most give me credit for." He moved toward the door but paused before leaving. "Thank you. For this," he gestured to his bandaged arm, "and for the recommendation to Cooper." "You're welcome, Hank," she smiled. "I hope Willow Creek treats you well." After he left, Josie remained in the back room for several minutes, her heart beating faster than usual. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, developing feelings for a man who clearly carried more secrets than a traveling salesman carried wares. Yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt, the instinct that told her there was more to Hank Harrington than met the eye, and that whatever darkness shadowed his past, it didn't define the man he truly was. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine punctuated by brief, increasingly comfortable encounters with Hank. He would stop by the mercantile every few days, sometimes to purchase supplies, other times seemingly just to exchange a few words with her. Each visit revealed another small facet of the man behind the hardened exterior, his unexpected knowledge of literature, when he spotted a volume of Whitman's poems behind her counter, the gentle way he helped Mrs. Peterson load her purchases into her wagon when her arthritis was acting up, his quiet sense of humor that emerged in subtle comments. The town's initial wariness began to ease somewhat as Hank proved himself a reliable worker at the Cooper Ranch. Frank Cooper himself stopped by the mercantile one afternoon and mentioned that Hank was one of the best hands he'd hired in years, skilled with horses and cattle alike, tireless in his work, and respectful to everyone on the ranch. Yet Sheriff Miller remained suspicious, and Josie occasionally caught him watching Hank from across the street, his expression troubled. Whatever name the sheriff was trying to place in his memory, he hadn't yet made the connection, but his continued scrutiny suggested he hadn't given up. One crisp October morning, Josie was inventorying her stock when the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool air, and Hank, his expression more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. "Morning," he greeted, removing his hat as always when entering her store. "Got the day off?" "Cooper's giving all the hands time for the harvest festival." "That's right," Josie smiled, suddenly remembering the annual celebration that would take place that evening. "The whole town turns out for it. There'll be music, dancing, food. Sounds like quite the affair." "It is," she agreed, then hesitated before adding, "Will you attend?" Something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps. "Not sure I'd be welcome. Some folks still look at me like I might shoot up the place." "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You've been here nearly 3 weeks without incident." "Besides," she added with a teasing smile, "it would be a shame to miss Mrs. Whittaker's apple pie. It won a blue ribbon at the Territorial Fair 2 years running." That earned a genuine laugh from him, a sound she'd heard only rarely. "Well, when you put it that way, how could I refuse?" Their eyes met, and the moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. "Would you?" he began, then stopped himself, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Yes," she prompted, her heart suddenly racing. He cleared his throat. "Would you save a dance for me?" "That is, if you don't mind being seen with the town's resident troublemaker." "I'd be honored," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Though I should warn you, I haven't danced in quite some time." That makes two of us." His expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face, making him look younger, unburdened. "I'll try not to step on your toes too badly." The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation for Josie. She closed the store early to give herself time to prepare, something she rarely did even for special occasions. From the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, she removed her best dress, a deep blue cotton with delicate lace trim that she'd made herself the previous winter. She washed her hair and pinned it up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face. As she studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, Josie acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was falling for Hank Harrington, despite knowing almost nothing about his past. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a tremulous hope she hadn't felt in years. The town square was transformed for the Harvest Festival, with lanterns hanging from ropes strung between buildings, tables laden with food, and a cleared area for dancing where a small band of local musicians played lively tunes. Nearly everyone in Willow Creek and the surrounding farms had turned out for the celebration, creating a festive atmosphere that belied the small size of their community. Josie had been there for nearly an hour, helping arrange food tables and greeting friends, when she spotted Hank at the edge of the gathering. He wore clean clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, and for once, she noticed he wasn't wearing his gun belt, a significant gesture in a town still wary of him. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Josie felt a flutter in her chest at the way his expression changed when he saw her, warmth replacing his usual guarded look. He made his way toward her, nodding politely to those who acknowledged him. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he reached her side. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "You clean up quite well yourself." Before he could respond, Mrs. Whitaker appeared beside them, her usual suspicion of Hank temporarily set aside in her role as one of the festival organizers. "Josie, dear, would you mind helping serve the cider? And Mr. Harrington, since you're here, those barrels need moving to the table." They exchanged amused glances at being immediately put to work, but neither complained. For the next half hour, they were kept busy with various tasks, though Josie was acutely aware of Hank's presence even when they were separated by the entire square. Finally, as dusk deepened into evening and the lanterns cast their golden glow over the festivities, the band struck up a waltz. Hank appeared at her side as if materializing from the shadows. "I believe you promised me a dance," he said, offering his hand. She placed her fingers in his, noting the contrast between his calloused palm and the gentleness of his touch. "So I did." He led her to the edge of the dancing area, his movements confident but not presumptuous. When he placed his hand respectfully at her waist and took her other hand in his, Josie felt as though the rest of the gathering had faded away, leaving just the two of them in a pool of lantern light. "I should warn you," he said softly as they began to move with the music. "It's been years since I've done this." "You're doing fine," she assured him, surprised by how naturally they moved together, finding a rhythm that seemed to come from some shared understanding rather than practice. As they danced, Josie became aware of curious glances from the townspeople, some approving, others concerned. Sheriff Miller watched from near the cider table, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them," Hank replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm only concerned with what you think." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "I think you're not what you seem, Hank Harrington, and I think I'd like to know the real you." Something vulnerable flashed in his eyes. "The real me might not be what you're hoping for, Josie." Why don't you let me decide that? Before he could answer, the music ended, and reality intruded in the form of Robert Fleming, one of the town council members, who approached them with a forced smile. "Josie, my dear, would you mind helping my wife with the dessert table? She's asking for you." His eyes flickered dismissively over Hank. "Excuse us, Harrington." Josie bristled at the obvious attempt to separate them. "I'm sure Mrs. Fleming can manage for a few more minutes, Mr. Fleming." "Hank and I were—" "It's all right," Hank interrupted gently. "Go help. I'll be around." Though reluctant, Josie nodded and allowed Fleming to lead her away. As she helped arrange pies and cakes on the dessert table, she kept glancing toward where she'd left Hank, but he had disappeared from sight. A sense of disappointment settled over her, wondering if he'd left entirely. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she could extract herself from her duties. She searched the festival, increasingly concerned that Hank had indeed departed, when she spotted him standing alone near the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers with a pensive expression. "I thought you might have left," she said as she approached. He turned to her with a hint of a smile. "Considered it, not really my kind of gathering." "Then why stay?" His eyes met hers, direct and honest. "You know why." The admission, simple as it was, made her heart race. "Would you walk me home?" she asked impulsively. "I think I've had enough of the festival for one night." Surprise and something else, hope, perhaps, flashed across his face before he nodded. "Lead the way." They walked in comfortable silence through the quieter streets of Willow Creek, the sounds of the festival fading behind them. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark canvas of the sky, and a nearly full moon illuminated their path. "I've been meaning to ask," Josie said as they neared her small house behind the mercantile, "how you came to be in Willow Creek." "It's not exactly on the main trails." Hank was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere I could maybe stop running for a while." "Running from what?" he sighed, the sound heavy with things unsaid. "My past, my reputation, take your pick." They reached her porch, and Josie turned to face him, emboldened by the shadows and the lingering magic of their dance. "Whatever you're running from, Hank, it doesn't have to define you forever." "Some things can't be outrun," he said softly. "Some sins can't be washed clean." "I don't believe that," she replied, stepping closer to him. "I believe people can change, can be more than their mistakes." His eyes searched hers, looking for judgment or fear and finding neither. "You see the good in everyone, don't you?" "Not everyone," she corrected. "But I see it in you, even if you don't see it yourself." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she held her breath in anticipation. Instead, he reached out slowly and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture so unexpectedly gallant it made her heart skip. "Good night, Josie Reeves," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for the dance." She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever secrets Hank Harrington carried, they had done nothing to diminish the growing feelings in her heart. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, the kind of pristine autumn day that seemed to be holding winter at bay through sheer golden perfection. Josie attended the morning church service as she always did, though her attention wandered repeatedly to the door, hoping Hank might appear. He never did, and she tried to quell her disappointment. He hadn't struck her as a church-going man, after all. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside in the sunshine, Sheriff Miller approached her with a serious expression that immediately set her on edge. "Might have a word, Josie?" he asked, gesturing away from the crowd. "Of course, Sheriff," she replied, following him to a quiet spot beneath an oak tree whose leaves had turned a brilliant red. Miller removed his hat, turning it absently in his hands. Been meaning to speak with you about your friendship with Harrington. I wasn't aware my friendships were the sheriff's concern, she said carefully. They are when they involve a man like him. Miller sighed heavily. I sent some telegrams, Josie, made some inquiries about our mysterious newcomer. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. And nothing concrete, yet. His eyes were kind but determined. But there are rumors from Texas, New Mexico Territory. Stories about a gunman named Harrington who rode with some unsavory characters a few years back. Rumors aren't facts, Sheriff, she countered, trying to keep her voice steady. No, they aren't, he agreed. But where there's smoke. Look, I'm not saying he's done anything wrong here. He's kept to himself, works hard for Cooper. But I've seen how he looks at you, and I've seen how you look at him. I'm just asking you to be careful until I know more about who we're really dealing with. I appreciate your concern, Josie said stiffly, but I'm a grown woman capable of making my own judgments about a person's character. Miller nodded, replacing his hat. Just consider yourself warned, Josie. Men like that, men who wear their guns like they know how to use them, they leave heartbreak in their wake, one way or another. The sheriff's warning lingered with Josie throughout the day, try as she might to dismiss it. By the time evening rolled around, she had worked herself into a state of restless uncertainty. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Decision made, she saddled her mare and rode out to the Cooper ranch, the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. It was perhaps improper for a single woman to call on a man this way, but propriety seemed less important than truth at the moment. She found Hank in the stable, grooming his black stallion after what had clearly been a long day's work. He looked up in surprise when she entered. Josie, he set down the brush and moved toward her. Everything all right? I need to ask you something, she said without preamble, and I need you to be honest with me. His expression grew guarded, but he nodded. Ask. Who are you really? Not the ranch hand who rode into Willow Creek last month, but before that. Who were you in Texas and New Mexico? Hank's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he sighed, gesturing toward a bench along the stable wall. Maybe you should sit down. They sat side by side, not quite touching, as the last light faded from the sky outside and the stable grew dim around them. My name is Hank Harrington, he began slowly. That much is true. I was born in Texas, raised on a cattle ranch near San Antonio. Lost my parents' young father to Comanche raiders, mother to fever a year later. My uncle took me in, taught me everything he knew. He paused, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. He was a hard man but fair, taught me to ride, rope, shoot. And after, Josie prompted gently when he fell silent. After he died, I drifted, worked ranches, drove cattle, then the war came. His voice grew rougher. Fought for the Confederacy, not because I believed in the cause, but because that's what Texans did. Saw things during those years that changed me, hardened me. He stood abruptly, moving to check on his horse as if the animal needed his attention, though Josie suspected he simply needed distance from the memories. After the war, work was scarce. I fell in with some men who didn't much care about the law, rode with them for nearly 2 years. He turned to face her, his expression challenging her to judge him. We robbed stage coaches, rustled cattle, never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill us first, but that's cold comfort to those we stole from. Josie remained silent, absorbing his words, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she'd come to care for. It ended badly, he continued after a moment. A job went wrong. 2 of our gang died, another was captured. I got away, but a man was hurt, a passenger who tried to stop us. I don't know if he lived. The pain in his eyes told her how much this particular memory haunted him. That's when I walked away, tried to put distance between myself and who I'd become. And the law, she asked quietly. Are they looking for you? Probably, though under a different name. I started using Harrington again after I left that life behind. He moved closer, his eyes searching hers. So now you know. I'm not the man you thought I was, Josie. I've done things I can't undo, hurt people who didn't deserve it. Why tell me now? You could have lied. Because you deserve the truth. His voice softened. And because what I feel for you is too real to be built on lies. The admission hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Josie stood, closing the distance between them until they were mere inches apart. The man who rode into Willow Creek, the man who works honestly for his pay, who treats others with respect, who dances with me under the harvest moon, that's who you are now, she said firmly. We all have pasts we wish we could change, Hank. Some darker than others, but none of us is defined solely by our worst mistakes. Hope and disbelief warred in his expression. You can't mean that, not after what I've told you. But I do, she insisted, reaching up to touch his face gently. The question isn't who you were, but who you're choosing to be now. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in the moment, her hand on his cheek, his eyes revealing more vulnerability than she'd ever seen in them. Then, with exquisite gentleness, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, sliding her hand to the nape of his neck and rising on her toes to meet him more fully, it deepened into something that made her forget everything but the feel of him, the scent of leather and horses and the fading day on his skin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Hank rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Good thing it's not about deserving, she replied with a small smile. It's about choosing, and I choose to believe in who you are now, not who you were then. The sound of approaching footsteps made them step apart moments before Frank Cooper appeared in the stable doorway, lantern in hand. Miss Reeves, he said, surprise evident in his voice. Didn't expect to find you here this time of evening. Mr. Cooper, she acknowledged, fighting the blush she could feel rising in her cheeks. I came to speak with Hank about an order for the store. I should be getting back to town now that we've concluded our business. Cooper's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation, but he merely nodded. It's getting dark. Harrington, why don't you ride with Miss Reeves back to town? Make sure she gets home safe. Yes, sir, Hank agreed, already moving to saddle his horse. The ride back to Willow Creek was largely silent, but it was a companionable silence filled with new understanding and unspoken promises. When they reached her home, Hank helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, she replied, summoning all her courage, you keep being the man I believe you can be, and we see where this leads us. His smile in the moonlight was the most genuine she'd ever seen from him. I'd like that, Josie Reeves. I'd like that very much. As she watched him ride back toward the ranch, Josie knew she was taking a risk with her heart, perhaps the greatest risk of her life. But something deep inside told her that this man, for all his troubled past, was worth believing in, worth fighting for. And she had never been one to back down from a fight. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Josie's life. Hank continued working at the Cooper Ranch, earning the respect of his fellow ranch hands through his tireless work ethic and quiet competence. He visited town more frequently, often timing his errands to coincide with the mercantile's slower periods so he could spend time with Josie without raising too many eyebrows. Their courtship, while not officially declared, became something of an open secret in Willow Creek. Some approved Mrs. Whitaker had reluctantly admitted that perhaps she judged Hank too harshly while others, like Robert Fleming and a few other prominent citizens, made their disapproval known through pointed remarks and cold shoulders. Sheriff Miller remained watchful, though his initial suspicion had given way to a wary acceptance as the weeks passed without incident. Whatever telegrams he was still sending and receiving about Hank's past, he kept the information to himself. As October gave way to November and the first hints of winter touched the air, Josie found herself looking forward to each encounter with Hank more eagerly than the last. They were careful to maintain propriety in public, a brush of hands here, a lingering look there, but in the private moments they managed to steal. Their connection deepened into something neither could deny. One such moment came on a brisk Sunday afternoon when Hank appeared at her door after church services had concluded, offering to help with some repairs to the mercantile's back storeroom that she'd mentioned needed attention. They worked side by side for hours, Hank replacing rotted floorboards while Josie organized inventory, their conversation flowing easily between them. "You're good at this," she observed as he expertly measured and cut a replacement board. "Carpentry, I mean." He smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him these days. "My uncle believed a man should know how to build and fix things with his own hands, said it was the measure of his worth." "Your uncle sounds like a wise man." "He was," Hank agreed, hammering a nail into place. "Strict, sometimes harsh, but he wanted me to be self-sufficient, to never have to depend on anyone else's charity or goodwill." "Is that why you left that life behind, the one you told me about?" she asked carefully, knowing they rarely spoke directly of his past. "Because it wasn't self-sufficient," he paused in his work, considering her question. "Partly. It was a hollow way to live, taking what others had earned honestly." He set down his hammer, wiping his hands on a rag. "But mostly, I left because I didn't like who I was becoming. Every job, every theft. It chipped away at something inside me, made it easier to justify the next one." Josie moved closer, sitting on a crate near where he worked. "What changed? What made you decide to walk away?" "That last job," he said quietly. "The one where the passenger got hurt. He was just an ordinary man trying to protect what was his, had a wife waiting for him somewhere." Hank's eyes met hers, the pain in them still raw after all this time. "I saw myself through his eyes in that moment, saw the monster I was becoming. Couldn't stomach it anymore." Without thinking, Josie reached out and took his hand, his skin rough against hers. "That ability to see yourself clearly, to choose a different path, that's courage, Hank. Real courage." He looked down at their joined hands. "Doesn't feel like courage when I'm still running from what I did." "Maybe running and facing are two sides of the same coin," she suggested. "You're facing who you are now, even if you're running from who you were then." A small smile touched his lips. "How is it you always find the good in things, Josie?" "In me." "Because it's there to be found," she replied simply. "You just have to be willing to see it." Their eyes held, the connection between them almost tangible in the quiet storeroom. Hank leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away before capturing her lips with his. Unlike their first kiss, which had been tentative and questioning, this one was sure of its welcome, deep and tender and full of unspoken promises. When they broke apart, Josie knew her cheeks were flushed and her hair slightly mussed, but she couldn't bring herself to care. "I'm falling in love with you, Hank Harrington," she whispered, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom. "Heaven help me, but I am." Something like wonder crossed his face, followed quickly by a shadow of doubt. "I don't deserve," "Don't," she interrupted, placing her fingers gently against his lips. "Don't tell me what you do or don't deserve. Just tell me if you feel the same." His hand came up to cradle her face, thumb brushing her cheek with exquisite tenderness. I love you, Josie. Have almost from the first moment I saw you standing on that boardwalk, looking at me like I was a storm cloud that might pass over or might break right above your head. His voice roughened with emotion. You make me believe I can be better than my past, that I can be worthy of someone like you. You already are, she assured him, leaning into his touch. The sound of the front door opening made them spring apart, Hank returning to his carpentry while Josie hastily straightened her hair before moving into the main store to greet whoever had entered. It was Mrs. Peterson, needing flour and eager to chat. By the time Josie had served her and seen her out, nearly half an hour had passed. She returned to the storeroom to find Hank putting the finishing touches on the last floorboard, his face contemplative. Everything all right? She asked, noting his pensive expression. He nodded, standing and brushing sawdust from his clothes. Just thinking about the future, about what kind of life I can offer you. The casual mention of a shared future made her heart leap, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not asking for promises, Hank. Maybe you should be, he replied, moving to stand before her. Maybe I need to start thinking beyond tomorrow, beyond just getting through each day without my past catching up to me. Before she could respond, another customer called from the front of the store, and the moment slipped away. By the time she'd finished with the elderly farmer who needed supplies, Hank had cleaned up the work area and was preparing to leave. I should get back to the ranch, he said, gathering his tools. Cooper needs all hands for the cattle drive to the winter pastures tomorrow. How long will you be gone? She asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns. He hesitated, then added, when I get back, there's something I'd like to discuss with you, something important. The serious tone made her both nervous and hopeful. I'll be here, he smiled, the expression warming his entire face. That's what keeps me going, Josie Reeves, knowing you'll be here. After he left, Josie found herself moving through the rest of her day in a daze of happiness mingled with nervous anticipation. Something important, he'd said. The possibilities of what that might mean both thrilled and terrified her. The following morning brought an unexpected development. Josie was just opening the mercantile when Sheriff Miller appeared, his expression grave. Morning, Josie, he said, removing his hat as he entered. Need a word if you have a moment. Of course, Sheriff, she replied, setting aside the ledger she'd been reviewing. What can I help you with? Miller glanced around as if ensuring they were alone before speaking. Got a telegram yesterday from the marshal in Santa Fe. Seems they've been looking for a man who matches Harrington's description. Part of a gang that operated in the New Mexico Territory a few years back. Josie's heart began to pound, though she kept her expression neutral. And they're sending a deputy marshal here to question him. Miller's eyes were sympathetic but determined. Should arrive on tomorrow's stage. Thought you should know given your attachment to him. She swallowed hard, mind racing. What exactly are they accusing him of? Stagecoach robbery, cattle rustling, and murder, Josie. They believe he was involved in the death of a passenger during a holdup near Albuquerque in '75. The blood drained from her face. Hank had admitted to the robbery, to a passenger being hurt, but not to murder. There must be some mistake, she managed. Maybe so, Miller conceded, but the deputy marshal will want to speak with him regardless. I suggest you prepare yourself for the possibility that your Mr. Harrington isn't who he claims to be. After the sheriff left, Josie stood frozen behind the counter, her mind churning with fear and uncertainty. Hank was on the cattle drive, unreachable until he returned. By then, the deputy marshal would be in Willow Creek, waiting to arrest him. She had to warn him. But how? The answer came to her as she recalled Frank Cooper mentioning that the winter pastures were on the north side of Miller's Ridge, about 15 miles from town. If she left immediately after closing the store and rode hard, she might reach them by nightfall. The decision made, Josie spent the day in a state of barely controlled anxiety, serving customers with mechanical politeness while her thoughts remained fixed on Hank and the danger approaching him. When closing time finally arrived, she wasted no time in locking up and hurrying to her small house to change into riding clothes. The November afternoon was already fading toward dusk as she saddled her mare, the air carrying a bite that promised snow before morning. She left a note for Mrs. Whitaker saying she'd gone to visit a friend on a nearby farm in case anyone came looking for her, then set out for Miller's Ridge, pushing her horse faster than was prudent as darkness began to fall. The journey was arduous, the terrain becoming increasingly rough as she approached the ridge. Night had fully descended, the moon obscured by gathering clouds, making navigation treacherous. Twice she had to backtrack when the trail she was following disappeared into rocky outcroppings. It was well past midnight when she finally spotted the glow of campfires in the valley below, relief flooding through her. The cattle drive had made camp for the night. As she approached, a figure emerged from the shadows, rifle raised. "Hold it right there," a gruff voice called. "I'm looking for Hank Harrington," she replied, her voice carrying more steadily than she felt. "It's urgent." The man lowered his rifle slightly as he recognized her. "Miss Reeves, what in tarnation are you doing out here this time of night?" "Please," she insisted, dismounting despite protesting muscles. "I need to speak with Hank. It's important." "He's on watch at the north end," the cowboy said, gesturing toward the far side of the camp. "But Mr. Cooper ain't gonna like a woman in camp. I'll explain to Mr. Cooper later," she interrupted, already moving in the direction indicated. "Thank you." She found Hank sitting alert beside a small fire, rifle across his knees as he kept watch over the sleeping cattle. His expression when he saw her approach was one of complete shock followed quickly by concern. "Josie," he rose swiftly, meeting her halfway. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No," she assured him, suddenly trembling now that she'd reached him. "But you're in danger." Sheriff Miller received a telegram. "There's a deputy marshal arriving tomorrow to arrest you for a stagecoach robbery in New Mexico. They're saying someone died, Hank." His face went pale in the firelight. "What?" "The passenger you told me about, the one who was hurt in that last robbery. He must have died of his injuries." She gripped his arms. "You need to leave, tonight, before they come for you." Hank stood frozen, the implications washing over him. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear to you, Josie, I didn't know he'd died. I would have told you." "I believe you," she said fiercely. "But they won't. You need to go head north into Montana Territory or west to California, somewhere they won't find you." He stared at her for a long moment, conflict raging in his eyes. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "What?" "Come with me, Josie." His hands came up to cradle her face. "We could start over somewhere new, together." The offer took her breath away. Leave Willow Creek, her store, everything she'd built since her father's death. It seemed impossible. And yet. "I can't ask that of you," Hank continued, reading the hesitation in her face. "You have a life here, a good one, but I had to offer. Had to let you know that whatever future I find, I want it to be with you." "Hank," she began, not sure what she was going to say, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Frank Cooper rode into view, his expression thunderous. "Miss Reeves, what in God's name are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" "And Harrington, you're supposed to be watching the herd, not entertaining visitors." "Mr. Cooper," Josie began, stepping forward. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there's an urgent matter. Whatever it is can wait till morning," Cooper interrupted firmly. "It's not safe for a woman to be riding these hills alone at night." Harrington, get someone to take your watch. You're escorting Miss Reeves back to town immediately." "But sir," Hank protested, "the cattle will manage without you for a few hours." "Get her home safely, then get yourself back here. That's an order." There was no arguing with Cooper's tone. Within minutes, Hank had saddled his horse and they were riding back toward Willow Creek, the cattle camp disappearing behind them. "This isn't what I wanted," Josie said once they were alone on the trail. "You were supposed to get away. And leave you to ride back through these hills alone. Not a chance." His voice was firm. "Besides, running now would just confirm my guilt in everyone's eyes." "Better that than hanging for murder." Hank reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her in the darkness. "Listen to me, Josie. I've been running for 3 years, looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Then I found Willow Creek, found you." His voice softened. "For the first time since I walked away from that life, I've felt like maybe I could stop running, like maybe I could build something real. But if they arrest you, then I'll face it," he said with quiet determination. "I'll tell the truth about what happened. I didn't kill that man, Josie. I was there. I was part of the robbery, but I didn't fire the shot that hit him." "Will that matter to the law? I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm tired of running from my past. If there's any chance for us to have a future together, it has to be built on truth, not lies and hiding." The first light of dawn was breaking as they reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, the town still quiet in the early morning hours. Hank insisted on seeing Josie safely to her door despite her protests that he should continue on, get as far away as possible before the deputy marshal arrived. "I need you to promise me something," he said as they stood on her porch, the eastern sky lightening behind them. "Whatever happens today, remember that what I feel for you is real. The man you've known these past weeks, that's the real me, Josie, not whatever they say I am." "I know that," she assured him, fighting back tears. "And I'll stand by you, Hank, whatever comes." He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that held all the words they hadn't said, all the futures they might not have. When they broke apart, his eyes were fierce with emotion. "I love you, Josie Reeves. Never doubt that." Then he was gone, riding back toward Cooper's ranch and whatever fate awaited him there. The stage arrived precisely at noon, right on schedule. Josie watched from the window of the mercantile as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dust-covered coat descended, the deputy marshal's badge glinting on his chest. Sheriff Miller was there to meet him, the two men exchanging a handshake before heading toward the sheriff's office. For hours, Josie went through the motions of running her store, attending to customers with a distracted politeness that earned her several concerned looks. Her mind was fixed on Hank, wondering if he'd returned to the cattle drive or if he'd heeded her advice and fled after all. Her answer came just before closing time when the bell above the door jangled and Sheriff Miller entered, accompanied by the deputy marshal and, to her shock, Hank himself. His hands were free, not in handcuffs as she'd feared, but his expression was grave. "Miss Reeves," Miller said formally. "Sorry to trouble you, but Deputy Marshal Harris here would like to ask you a few questions about Mr. Harrington." Her eyes found Hank's, silently questioning. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, a signal that it was all right to speak freely. "Of course," she managed, gesturing toward the chairs near the pot-bellied stove. "Please sit down." The deputy marshal, a weathered man perhaps in his 40s with keen eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, remained standing. "I understand you've been acquainted with Mr. Harrington since he arrived in Willow Creek, Miss Reeves." "That's correct," she replied cautiously. "And in that time, has he ever spoken to you about his activities in New Mexico Territory between 1873 and 1875? She hesitated, glancing again at Hank. His expression revealed nothing, but she made her decision in that moment. Yes, he told me he was involved with a gang that robbed stage coaches and rustled cattle during that period. The deputy's eyebrows rose slightly. Did he now? And did he mention a particular robbery near Albuquerque in late 1875? One where a passenger was shot. He told me there was an incident where a passenger was injured, she confirmed, her heart pounding. But he believed the man had survived. He didn't know until yesterday that he had died. Interesting, Harris murmured, his sharp gaze shifting between Josie and Hank. And you believed him? A known outlaw. I believe he's been honest with me, yes, she replied firmly. Hank regrets his past actions deeply. He's worked hard to build a new life here, an honest life. The deputy marshal made a non-committal sound. Well, I appreciate your candor, Miss Reeves. He turned to Hank. We'll continue this discussion at the sheriff's office, Harrington. As they prepared to leave, Josie caught Hank's arm. What's happening? Are they arresting you? Not yet, he replied quietly. The deputy has questions about the Albuquerque robbery. Seems some new information has come to light. Before she could ask what he meant, Sheriff Miller ushered them out, leaving Josie alone with her fears and questions. The hours that followed were some of the longest of her life. She closed the store, tried to eat something but found she had no appetite, and finally sat by her window watching the sheriff's office across the street and down a ways, waiting for any sign of what was happening. It was well after nightfall when she saw the door open, and 3 men emerged: Sheriff Miller, Deputy Marshal Harris, and Hank. They stood talking for several minutes, their breath visible in the cold night air, before shaking hands. To her astonishment, the deputy marshal then mounted his horse and rode away, while Hank and the sheriff continued their conversation for a few moments more before parting ways. She was on her porch when Hank approached, his face impossible to read in the darkness. "Josie," he said simply, stopping at the bottom of her steps. "What happened?" she asked, unable to contain her anxiety any longer. "Are you free?" he finished, a note of wonder in his voice. "At least of the murder charge." Relief flooded through her so strongly she had to grip the porch railing to steady herself. "How?" Hank climbed the steps slowly, as if still processing the events himself. "The passenger, his name was Edward Calloway. He didn't die from his gunshot wound. He recovered, then caught pneumonia 6 months later. That's what killed him." He shook his head in disbelief. "All this time I've been carrying the weight of his death, and it wasn't even by my hand." "Oh, Hank," she breathed, reaching for him. He took her hands in his eyes serious in the faint light spilling from her window. "I'm not completely in the clear, Josie. There are still charges for the robberies, the cattle rustling. But Deputy Harris says if I provide information about the rest of the gang, testify against the leaders who are still at large, he'll recommend leniency." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I need to travel to Santa Fe in the spring to give my testimony." His thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. "It means I might face some jail time, a year, maybe 2, depending on the judge, but not hanging, not a life sentence." The thought of him in jail, even for a year, made her heart ache. But it was far better than the alternatives she'd been imagining. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Cooper's agreed to keep me on at the ranch, at least until I have to go to Santa Fe. After that." He trailed off, uncertainty clouding his features. "I don't know what kind of future I can offer you now, Josie, not with this hanging over my head." "You love me?" she asked simply. "More than I thought possible," he replied without hesitation. "Then that's all that matters. The rest we'll face together." She stepped closer, sliding her arms around his waist. "I'm not afraid of hard times, Hank. I'm only afraid of losing you." He drew her close, his embrace fierce and protective. "You won't lose me. Whatever happens, I'll come back to you, that's a promise." As they stood together on her porch, the future still uncertain but filled with more hope than either had dared imagine just hours before, Josie knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The man who had ridden into town like trouble had found redemption in her love, and she had found in him a strength and tenderness she hadn't known she was seeking. The winter passed in a blur of quiet moments and deepening bonds. Hank continued working at the Cooper Ranch, earning enough to rent a small cabin on the edge of town, a modest step toward the future he hoped to build. He and Josie spent every free moment together, their relationship blossoming despite the lingering uncertainty of his legal situation. The town's opinion had shifted dramatically following the deputy marshal's visit. Once the truth became known that Hank had voluntarily come forward, that he was cooperating with the law to bring more dangerous criminals to justice, many who had viewed him with suspicion began to see him in a different light. Even Robert Fleming, one of his most vocal critics, grudgingly acknowledged that a man willing to face his past mistakes deserved a measure of respect. Sheriff Miller, perhaps the most surprised by the turn of events, became an unexpected ally. He vouched for Hank's character to anyone who questioned it, and even offered to write a letter to the judge in Santa Fe testifying to his reformation. As February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring softened the Wyoming landscape, Hank and Josie began making tentative plans for the future, a future they both knew would have to weather the storm of his upcoming testimony and whatever consequences it brought. "I've been thinking," Hank said one evening as they sat together on her porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. "After all this is over, after I've served whatever time the court decides, maybe we could start fresh somewhere, leave Willow Creek." Josie asked, surprised. She'd assumed they would build their life here where they'd found each other. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Not too far, maybe up toward the Montana border. There's good land there, they say. I've been saving most of my wages. Might be enough for a small place of our own." He glanced at her, uncertainty in his eyes. "Would you consider it? Leaving the mercantile, starting over?" The question stirred mixed emotions in her. The store had been her father's legacy, her connection to the past. And yet, the thought of building something new with Hank, something that was truly theirs, held an undeniable appeal. "I'd consider it," she said slowly. "The mercantile has been my life for so long, but it's just a building, just a business. What matters is that we're together." His smile was like the breaking of dawn after a long night. "Then that's what we'll do. Once this is behind us, we'll start fresh. No more looking over our shoulders, no more shadows from the past." As March progressed, however, reality intruded on their plans. A telegram arrived from Deputy Marshal Harris, requesting Hank's presence in Santa Fe earlier than expected. The trial of his former gang leaders had been moved up, and he needed to be there within 2 weeks. The news hit them both hard. They'd been anticipating this moment, but the sudden acceleration of the timeline left them reeling. "I could come with you," Josie suggested as they discussed the situation in the privacy of her small parlor. "Mrs. Whitaker could watch the store for a few weeks." Hank shook his head firmly. "Santa Fe isn't safe for you right now. These men I'll be testifying against, they have friends, family who might take exception to my cooperation with the law." His eyes were serious as they met hers. "I won't risk your safety, Josie, not for anything." Though she wanted to argue, she recognized the wisdom in his words. "How long will you be gone?" The deputy estimates a month, maybe more. He took her hands in his. "And after the trial?" "Well, that depends on the judge's sentence." The unspoken possibility hung between them that he might be gone for much longer than a month. that the leniency promised by Deputy Harris might not materialize. "Then we shouldn't waste the time we have left," Josie said, forcing a brightness into her voice she didn't entirely feel. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow. Early morning stage. 2 days. Just 2 days before he would ride away, before she would have to learn to live with his absence for who knew how long." "Then I have a request," she said, making a decision in that moment that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Marry me, Hank, before you go." His eyes widened in shock. "Josie, I know what you're going to say," she continued hurriedly. "That we should wait, that we should be sure of your legal situation first. But I am sure of you, of us. I want to be your wife when you face that courtroom. I want the judge, the jury, everyone to know that you have someone who believes in you, who's waiting for you." Emotion flooded his face, too complex to name. "You deserve better than a rushed ceremony before I'm hauled off to face justice. You deserve a proper wedding, a proper start to our life together. What I deserve is to be with the man I love in whatever way we can manage," she countered. "The rest is just details." For a long moment, he stared at her, conflict evident in his expression. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his face, not the guarded smile she'd first known, but the full, genuine one she'd come to cherish. "Josie Reeves," he said, sliding from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to her eyes, happiness bubbling up like a spring. "Yes, Hank Harrington, I would be proud to be your wife." The next day passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Josie spoke with Reverend Matthews, who agreed to perform a small ceremony the following morning before the stage departed. Mrs. Whitaker, initially scandalized by the hasty wedding plans, softened when Josie explained the circumstances and insisted on hosting a modest breakfast afterward at the boarding house. Word spread quickly through the small town, and to Josie's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Women she'd known all her life appeared at her door with small gifts and offers of help. Martha Cooper, Frank's wife, brought a beautiful hand-pieced quilt as a wedding present. Even Sheriff Miller stopped by the Mercantile to express his good wishes and promise to look after Josie during Hank's absence. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect early spring day that seemed like a blessing on their union. Josie wore her best dress, not a traditional wedding gown, but a lovely blue frock that matched her eyes. Mrs. Whitaker had fashioned a small bouquet of early wildflowers and sprigs of evergreen, tying it with a white ribbon from her sewing basket. The church was more full than Josie had expected, nearly half the town turning out to witness the union of the reformed outlaw and the mercantile owner who had seen the good in him when others had not. Hank stood at the altar waiting for her, clean-shaven and dressed in new clothes he must have purchased specially for the occasion. The look in his eyes when she walked down the aisle toward him, wonder, love, and a fierce determination, was one she knew she would carry with her through the difficult days ahead. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever life might bring. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Hank bent to kiss her with exquisite tenderness, Josie felt as though her heart might burst with happiness, despite the shadow of their imminent separation. The breakfast at Mrs. Whitaker's was a surprisingly joyful affair. The boarding house dining room filled with well-wishers and an atmosphere of celebration that defied the circumstances. Frank Cooper made a toast to the newlyweds, his words gruff but sincere as he praised Hank's work ethic and promised his job would be waiting for him upon his return. All too soon, however, the time came for goodbyes. The stage would be departing within the hour, and Hank needed to be on it. They stood together on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, the same spot where they had first met months earlier, now husband and wife facing a separation neither could predict the length of. "I'll write," Hank promised, holding her close. "Every chance I get. And I'll be back as soon as I can, Josie, no matter what the judge decides." "I know you will," she replied, fighting back tears, "and I'll be here waiting, for however long it takes." He kissed her one last time, a kiss that held all the love and longing and promise between them, before reluctantly pulling away. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, the name bringing a smile to both their faces despite the circumstances. "Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" "The nicest," she agreed, managing a watery smile. Then he was walking away, his tall figure moving toward the stagecoach that would carry him to Santa Fe and whatever fate awaited him there. At the last moment, he turned back, tipping his hat to her in a gesture that was both playful and deeply tender. As the stage pulled away, dust rising in its wake, Josie stood watching until it disappeared from sight. Only then did she allow herself a moment of private grief for the separation that lay ahead. But it was tempered by hope for the future they had promised each other, the life they would build together when he returned. The man who had ridden into town like trouble had become her husband, his hard edges softened by love, his troubled past facing resolution through courage rather than continued flight. And she, Josie Reeves Harrington, would be waiting for him, no matter how long it took for him to come home to her. The following months were a study in patience and perseverance for Josie. She threw herself into running the Mercantile, expanding her inventory, and even beginning a small mail-order business that served outlying ranches and farms too distant for regular trips to town. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied during the long days of waiting. Hank's letters arrived with surprising regularity, sometimes brief notes scrawled on rough paper, other times longer missives that detailed his experiences in Santa Fe and his hopes for their future. From these, she pieced together the progress of the trial and his own legal situation. His testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against the leaders of his former gang, including the man who had actually fired the shot that wounded Edward Calloway. As promised, Deputy Marshal Harris had spoken on Hank's behalf at his own sentencing, emphasizing his voluntary cooperation and his efforts to build an honest life in Willow Creek. The judge, influenced by these testimonials and additional character references from Sheriff Miller and Frank Cooper, which Josie had arranged to be sent to Santa Fe, had shown considerable leniency. Hank was sentenced to 18 months in the territorial prison, far less than the 5 to 10 years such crimes typically warranted. "It's more than fair," he wrote in the letter informing her of the sentence. "And Deputy Harris says with good behavior, I might be released in a year or even less. Just knowing there's an end date, knowing I'll be coming home to you makes it bearable, Josie. For the first time in years, I can see a clear path forward, a real future." She read that letter so many times the paper began to wear thin at the folds. A year. It seemed simultaneously an eternity, and given what might have been, a miracle of brevity. Summer faded into fall, fall into winter, the seasons marking time in their separation. Josie maintained their modest cabin, visiting regularly to ensure it remained in good repair for Hank's eventual return. She planted a small garden behind it in the spring, imagining him beside her tending the rows of vegetables and herbs. The town of Willow Creek watched her quiet dignity with admiration. She was no longer merely Josie from the Mercantile, but Mrs. Harrington, a woman whose loyalty and faith in her husband had transformed not only his life but, in subtle ways, the community itself. When Christmas arrived, their first Christmas as husband and wife, spent apart, a delegation from the church ladies' auxiliary appeared at her door with a holiday basket and invitations to several homes for dinner. She accepted Mrs. Whittaker's, touched by the woman's complete reversal of opinion regarding Hank. He proved himself a man of character, the older woman explained as they sat by the fire after dinner. Taking responsibility for his past instead of running from it, that takes courage, real courage. And you saw that in him from the beginning, didn't you? I saw someone trying to be better than his past, Josie replied simply. Someone who deserved a chance to prove who he really was. As winter released its grip on Wyoming and the first hints of spring began to appear, Josie received a letter that made her heart race with excitement and nerves. Hank had been granted early release for good behavior. He would be coming home in just 3 weeks' time. Those final weeks of waiting were perhaps the most difficult of all. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, planted early vegetables in the garden, and made sure the pantry was stocked with all his favorite foods. She ordered new curtains for the windows and a comfortable chair for the small sitting room, determined that their home should be as welcoming as possible for his return. The day before his expected arrival, Sheriff Miller stopped by the Mercantile with unexpected news. "Just got a telegram from Deputy Marshal Harris," he said, handing her the paper. "Thought you'd want to see it right away." Josie scanned the brief message, her heart leaping into her throat. Harrington released stop escorting him personally to Willow Creek. Stop arriving tomorrow afternoon. Stage stop. Harris, the deputy marshal, is bringing him home himself, she asked, surprised. Miller nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. It seems Hank made quite an impression in Santa Fe. Harris mentioned in an earlier telegram that he's been recommending him for some kind of position. Didn't give details. The news left Josie both curious and slightly concerned. What kind of position would a deputy marshal recommend for a former outlaw? And would it mean leaving Willow Creek after all? She pushed the questions aside, focusing instead on the joy of Hank's imminent return. Tomorrow. After nearly 14 months of separation, tomorrow she would be in his arms again. The town seemed to share her anticipation. Word spread quickly about Hank's return, and by noon the following day, an unofficial welcoming committee had gathered near the stagecoach stop. Frank and Martha Cooper were there, along with Mrs. Whittaker, Reverend Matthews, and several of the ranch hands who had worked alongside Hank. Josie stood slightly apart from the others, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone must hear it. She had dressed with special care in a new green dress that emphasized her eyes, her hair arranged in soft curls around her face. Would he notice the subtle changes in her appearance? Would he himself be changed by his time away? The distant rumble of the approaching stagecoach sent a ripple of excitement through the waiting crowd. As it rolled into view, dust billowing behind it, Josie found herself holding her breath, hands clasped tightly before her. The coach came to a stop with a creak of wheels and a snort from the tired horses. The door opened, and Deputy Marshal Harris emerged first, scanning the gathered crowd with mild surprise before his gaze settled on Josie. He tipped his hat to her, then turned to offer assistance to the second passenger. And then Hank was there, stepping down from the stagecoach, his eyes immediately finding hers across the short distance that separated them. He looked leaner, his face more weathered, but his eyes, those blue eyes that had captured her from the first, were unchanged in their intensity as they locked with hers. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the moment suspended between them like a held breath. Then Josie was running, propriety forgotten, and Hank was striding toward her, arms opening just in time to catch her as she flung herself into his embrace. "Josie," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion as he held her close. "My Josie." She couldn't speak, tears of joy rendering her momentarily mute as she clung to him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid reality of his arms around her. He was home. After all the waiting, all the uncertainty, he was finally home. When they finally broke apart, it was to the sound of applause from the gathered townspeople. Hank looked around in genuine surprise at the welcoming committee, clearly not having expected such a reception. "Quite a homecoming," Deputy Marshal Harris observed dryly, though there was warmth in his expression. "Told you things had changed, Harrington." The next hour passed in a blur of handshakes and well wishes as the town welcomed Hank back. Frank Cooper confirmed that his position at the ranch was still available whenever he was ready to return. Mrs. Whittaker insisted they come to the boarding house for a special dinner that evening to celebrate. Even Robert Fleming approached to offer a somewhat stiff but sincere handshake and welcome. Throughout it all, Hank kept Josie close by his side, his hand holding hers as if afraid she might somehow disappear if he let go. She couldn't stop looking at him, drinking in the sight of him, noting the new lines around his eyes, the way his hair had grown slightly longer, the increased breadth of his shoulders. When they finally managed to extract themselves from the well-wishers and make their way to their cabin, a comfortable silence fell between them. Hank stood in the middle of their small living room, taking in the changes she'd made: the new curtains, the chair by the fireplace, the vase of fresh wildflowers on the table. "You've been busy," he observed, his voice soft with appreciation. "I wanted it to feel like home for you," she replied. He turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "It's not the curtains or the furniture that makes it home, Josie. It's you. Only you." Then he was crossing the room in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms and kissing her with all the pent-up longing of their months apart. She responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair as she pressed herself against him, reveling in the solid warmth of his body against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "I've dreamed of holding you every night for 14 months, he murmured. "Dreamed of coming home to you, of starting our life together properly." "Well, you're home now," she said, her voice low and full of promise, "and we have all the time in the world." Later, as twilight deepened outside their window, they lay tangled together in their bed, Josie's head resting on Hank's chest as he absently stroked her hair. The physical reunion had been everything both had dreamed of during their separation, tender at moments, passionate at others, a reaffirmation of their connection that transcended the months and miles that had separated them. "There's something I need to tell you," Hank said into the comfortable silence. "Something Deputy Harris and I discussed on the journey here." Josie propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the fading light. "Is this about the position Sheriff Miller mentioned?" "The one Harris recommended you for," Hank nodded, his expression a mix of pride and uncertainty. "The territorial governor is expanding law enforcement in the northern counties. Too many small towns with no proper sheriff or marshal. Harris suggested me for one of the positions." "You?" Josie couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "As a lawman," a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That was my reaction too. But Harris made a good point. Who better to uphold the law than someone who knows firsthand the cost of breaking it, someone with my particular experiences." Josie considered this, trying to picture Hank wearing a badge instead of being wary of those who did. "Where would this position be?" she asked, the most pressing question in her mind. "That's the best part," he replied, his smile widening. "A small settlement called Pine Ridge, about 60 miles north of here. close enough to visit Willow Creek regularly but far enough to truly be a fresh start. He searched her face. "What do you think, Josie? Would you be willing to be a lawman's wife, to start over in a new place?" She thought of the mercantile, of the life she'd built in Willow Creek. But looking into Hank's eyes, seeing the hope and purpose that now animated him, she knew her answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that the man who rode into town like trouble has come a very long way." She traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "And I think I would be proud to be the wife of a man who's found his true calling, whatever that might be." Relief and joy flooded his expression. "We'll build something good there, Josie, something meaningful, together." "Together," she agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. 5 years later, the town of Pine Ridge had grown from a scattered settlement to a thriving community, due in no small part to the steady leadership of Sheriff Hank Harrington and the community-building efforts of his wife, Josie. Their home on the edge of town had expanded along with their family. 3-year-old Thomas and 1-year-old Emma had filled their lives with the kind of joy neither had dared dream of during those early, uncertain days in Willow Creek. Josie had opened a small general store that served as both business and community gathering place, while Hank had established himself as a fair, firm lawman whose reputation for giving second chances had become legendary throughout the territory. On a warm summer evening, as they sat together on their porch watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard while Emma slept peacefully in her father's arms, Josie reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You ever think about it?" she asked softly. "That first day in Willow Creek, how different everything might have been if you just kept riding through." Hank's free arm tightened around her shoulders. "Every day," he admitted. "I was so close to doing just that, continuing north, never stopping. But something made me rein in right there in front of your store." "What was it?" she asked, curious about this detail he'd never shared before. He smiled, the expression now coming easily to him, the hardness that had once defined his features long softened by love and purpose. "You," he said simply. "Standing there with your broom, looking at me like you weren't sure whether to run inside or stand your ground, and you chose to stand your ground. It made me curious." "Curious enough to stay," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Best decision I ever made," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Well, second best. Marrying you was the first." As the fireflies danced in the gathering dusk, and their son's laughter filled the air, Josie silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought Hank Harrington riding into Willow Creek that September day. The cowboy who had arrived like trouble had found redemption in her love, and she had found in him a partner, protector, and passionate heart that completed her own. Together, they had built a life neither could have imagined alone, a life of purpose, community, and abiding love that had transformed not just themselves, but all those around them. And in the gentle man who now held their daughter with such tenderness, there remained just enough of that dangerous edge to remind Josie of how far they had come, and how much they had overcome to find their happiness together.